Okay, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us for our second installment of the 8th inaugural Research Bites. My name is Chioma Moye, and I'm a fourth year majoring in critical race and ethnic studies and cinema media studies, as well as the communications intern for the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture. The monthly Research Bite series is one of many programs that we initiated to celebrate the center's 25 years of engaging scholars, students, staff, and community members in interdisciplinary scholarship and programming around the topics of race and ethnicity. Thank you to Beth, our program coordinator, and Tiara, our programming administrator, for your work behind the scenes. Our goal for this series is to connect staff from across the university with faculty affiliates of the center who study, teach, and write about race and ethnicity. We wanted to create an informal and interactive space where we can learn firsthand about some of the exciting research happening on campus, and to provide an opportunity for faculty and staff to network with hope that we find some shared interests and responsibilities for future collaborations. You can subscribe to our Research Bites and CSRPC listservs to be notified of future conversations. The first 25 staff members to register for Research Bite events will receive a $25 Grubhub credit to buy lunch on us. Congratulations to those who are enjoying their lunches right now. And today we are joined by a very special guest, Professor Ryan Cecil Jobson. Jobson is the Neubauer Family Assistant Professor of Anthropology at the University of Chicago. He received his PhD in Anthropology and African American Studies from Yale University in 2017. His research is broadly preoccupied with questions of extractive fossil fuels, postcolonial sovereignty, climate, and political futures in the Caribbean. His first book, manuscript, The Petro-State Masquerade, is a historical ethnography of the oil and gas development and post-colonial state building in Trinidad and Tobago. Jobson is also the guest editor of a special issue of Small Acts, States of Crisis, Disaster, Recovery, and Possibility in the Caribbean, published in July 2020. His writing is featured in Current Anthropology, American Anthropologist, the Journal of Latin American and Caribbean Anthropology, and Small Acts. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to our faculty affiliate, Professor Jobson.
Thank you for that really lovely introduction, Chioma, and thanks for having me this afternoon. It's a real pleasure to see this many faces or names in the audience on Zoom. And it's also a lot of fun to be able to talk about this project now that I can finally say that there is a complete manuscript. That doesn't mean that the publication is imminent, but it does mean that I have a manuscript that I have submitted that I'm going to be talking about with you all today. So I certainly look forward to sharing certain aspects of the manuscript. I actually intentionally organized this talk around bites, right? So we call it Research Bites, both because some of you are eating lunch, I assume, but also I wanted to sort of offer and read some vignettes from different sections of the project. So I expect this will be scattered, but I hope not disconnected, so you can engage with different aspects of the research that I've done, and also just with the arc of the book as a whole. So I'm gonna share my screen so I can offer some visuals along with my comments, and then I'm going to jump right in. So I guess just to begin, before I start reading actually from the opening pages of the manuscript, I should say that, you know, the Petro-State Masquerade, as Chioma said, is a historical ethnography of oil and gas development in Trinidad and Tobago that really looks at what I'm calling the development of a masquerade of permanence from the early 20th century, really the 1930s is where I begin this narrative, up to the present. So I'm happy to talk more about my methods and how this project came to be really over the past 14 years since I first went to Trinidad to conduct research for my senior undergraduate thesis. I'm going to start with a vignette that I think will sort of frame the rest of the my comments. And then, as I said, I'm going to proceed through different bites from the manuscript. Feel free actually to toss questions into the chat at any time, because I do want to keep this informal, but I will continue to read from different sections just to facilitate conversation. So the Odyssey of the Deepwater Champion, pictured here, begins at the Hyundai Heavy Industry Shipyard in Ulsan, South Korea. Commissioned in 2010 by the Texas-founded Switzerland-based contractor, Transocean, at a cost of $740 million US, Hyundai fabricators outfitted the 6th-generation drill ship with 2 rig stations equipped to drill to up to 12,000 feet of water and to subterranean depths of 40,000 feet. Drill ships, prized for their mobility, enabled by autonomous propulsion systems, travel expediently from one drill site to the next without the aid of independent towing vessels. These capabilities allowed the Deepwater Champion to make fast work of deepwater hydrocarbon frontiers. Initially leased by ExxonMobil for offshore operations in Turkey, the drillship completed its maiden voyage under a Vanuatuan flag of convenience after it passed through the Bosphorus Strait in Istanbul. After this pilot drilling program, it entered the territorial waters of Romania for another venture in the Black Sea. The Deepwater Champion then crossed the Atlantic Ocean to the US Gulf of Mexico, where it began a 3-year contract in June 2012, before exiting ahead of schedule to spud an exploratory well in Guyana in 2015. Drilling proceeded despite territorial claims by the neighboring Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. It generated the first major offshore discovery in Guyana with a productive potential of more than 700 million barrels of crude oil equivalent. The Deepwater Champion, this drill ship, earned a reputation for its record of commercial success during a boom in deepwater oil and gas production. The oil bonanza stoked corporate enthusiasm in deepwater futures. For ExxonMobil, the deepwater constituted a chief area of expansion. In 2014, then CEO of ExxonMobil, Rex Tillerson, forecasted worldwide deepwater production to grow 150% by 2040. Alongside the extractive innovations of North American shale and Canadian tar sands, Tillerson's mantra of going deeper promised to unlock new reserves in perpetuity. Unconventional hydrocarbon frontiers like this ushered in an era of fossil fuel abundance. Enjoying the spoils of abundance for the first half-decade of its productive life, the operators of the Deepwater Champion did not concern themselves with whether another frontier would emerge. The commercial viability of the deepwater offered no occasion for pause. Rather than a question of if another deepwater frontier would present itself, it remained a matter of where and when it would deploy to next. But the boom did not last. In the final months of 2014, crude prices nosedived when competition between Saudi crude and US shale oil produced a glut in world oil supplies. Price of oil dropped below $27 per barrel in January 2016, its lowest level since May 2003. For the Deepwater Champion, the bear market ushered in a moment of uncertainty. After the Guyana venture in 2015, Transocean failed to secure a contract for its juggernaut drillship. Gambling on a long-term market recovery, Transocean opted for a strategy of cold stacking in which it powered down its drillship fleet, emptied its crews, and indefinitely stationed its abandoned ships offshore. Unlike a more common practice of warm stacking, in which drillships are kept running by a minimal staff, cold stacking served as a novel cost-saving measure for Transocean to weather the market tides. In the immediate term, the strategy assured shareholders of the company's ability to kill time and curb losses ahead of a market recovery. Even when Transocean removed more drillships from service, it reported profits of $77 million US in the second quarter of 2016, prompting an 8% spike in stock value. While reassuring to shareholders, cold stacking risked the long-term viability of Transocean's deepwater program. As long as deepwater investments flourished, drill ships like the Deepwater Champion had never been turned off. Accustomed to the frenzied itineraries of deepwater operations, one Transocean electrician reasoned that its drill ships were not designed to sit idle. Moreover, it remained unclear what would happen if and when cold stack drill ships returned to operation. To do so would require engineers to reprogram thousands of drilling presets. The cold stack gamble was twofold. First, Transocean placed its bets on a long-term recovery of oil and gas markets. Second, it wagered that the capital that was frozen in these cold stack drill ships could be powered back up and returned to active drilling. The Deepwater Champion set off on its final journey in 2016 when it joined Transocean's flotilla of mothballed rigs in the Gulf of Paria off the west coast of Trinidad. A Bloomberg news brief relayed the inauspicious scene, and I quote, "In a far corner of the Caribbean Sea, one of those idyllic spots touched most days by little more than a fisherman chasing blue marlin, billions of dollars of the world's finest oil equipment bobs quietly in the water. Cashing in on its relatively calm waters as a maritime storage for inactive rigs, the government of Trinidad and Tobago leased offshore acreage at a minimal cost of $8,000 US per ship per day. The journey of the Deepwater Champion that I've recounted here concludes where my inquiry begins at this far corner of the Caribbean Sea. In Trinidad and Tobago, this is a story of how the market futures of oil and gas and the political futures of a post-colonial nation state became indelibly linked. But the common fate of TNT and its abundant hydrocarbons was not predestined. Although Trinidad is one of the oldest oil-producing territories, arguably the site of the first oil well in 1857, the common sense association of Trinidad with oil continues to rest on development and innovations far beyond its tropical shores. The importance of oil and gas to Trinidad locally cannot be understated. Petroleum and petrochemical industries account for approximately 37% of the GDP and 70% of exports. Yet, due to advances in extractive technologies, the energy sector today accounts for merely 5% of total employment. Despite this vital role in generating state revenue, Trinidad and Tobago accounts for only 0.15% of global natural gas reserves and 0.04% of crude oil reserves. Despite the seeming permanence of Trinidad oil and gas after more than a century of commercial production, their persistence rests on a precarious assembly of global infrastructures, shipping routes, and multinational firms. In the theater of the Trinbagonian Petro-State, this dependence masquerades as independence. So this is the way that I open the book manuscript, which is, a sort of inversion of the typical anthropological landing scene, right? That to understand oil in Trinidad and Tobago requires us to look to South Korea, requires us to look to ExxonMobil's corporate offices. This is a way to sort of displace the narrative that often surrounds oil in Trinidad. And the way the manuscript then is framed is really as a genealogy of two competing forces that exist alongside this effort to equate hydrocarbons and political power in Trinidad and Tobago. So we can think of the Petro-State, right, as a hyphenated term, and that hyphen is linking these two sides of the equation. How do they come into balance? How might they be driven apart? And in particular, I was conducting my research during this very period of a global decline in oil and gas markets from 2014 to 2015. And I was really preoccupied with how the imaginary of the Petro-State persists against the backdrop of declining production, depressed energy markets, and the shuttering of industrial facilities. So what we see pictured here on the left is a protest by the Oilfield Workers Trade Union after the oil refinery in Pointe-à-Pierre was shuttered for the first time in more than 100 years. So now it is sitting idle. We also see many petrochemical facilities on the right at Point Lisa's industrial estate that have been shuttered and workers sent to the bread lines. The question is, how does this masquerade of permanence, the idea that oil and gas will always persist as the substrate of economic and political power in Trinidad and Tobago, continue to unlock itself? So I'm going to read another vignette here that sort of describes the contours of what I'm calling the Petro-State Masquerade, but also can be easily applied to the question of statecraft in general, so the state masquerade. So at a moment when the permanence of oil and gas production is called into question by depressed energy markets, the hyphenated relation of the Petro-State is no longer the immortal confluence of political power and carbon energy that it appears to be. As familiar as the term Petro-State is today, it is a novel political form that only came into being with the subterranean energy transformations of the 20th century. To expect that this political form is to persevere through the 21st century is perhaps a fatal error on the part of Trinidad and Tobago and its fossil fuel exporting counterparts. Yet even as the potency of this hyphenated relation wanes, appeals to the longevity of the oil and gas sector persists among industry magnates and state officials in what I'm calling a masquerade of permanence. Troubled by declining production and the risk of deep water ventures, which has become sort of the signature growth sector that's projected by Trinidadian officials. The Trinbagonian Petro-State employs an array of stagings, gestures, and public spectacles to assert its legitimacy with internal public and external audiences of corporations, creditors, and trading partners. Through avenues of public address, including press conferences, memoranda of understanding, offshore bid rounds, and publicly funded infrastructure projects, the state adopts this carnivalesque register of the masquerade, not unlike Transocean's cold stacking gamble that I just recounted for you all. The uncertain future of the Trinidad oil and gas sector masquerades as certainty, the fragile hyphenated relation of the Petro-State masquerades as permanent and indivisible. So this is the Petro-State Masquerade. On the other hand, I'm also looking at another force that both emerges and persists throughout, I would say, the colonial and post-colonial history of Trinidad and Tobago, which I'm calling the People's Masquerade, or in Trinidadian parlance, People's Mas. So I'm also thinking about how ordinary people continually stage alternatives to the fossil economy and to the sort of arrangement of colonial and Westminster parliamentary governance through masquerades of their own. So I'm thinking about acts of sabotage, protest, occupation, and blockade that elsewhere I've called practices of road work. A lot of this is involved methodologically, a sort of deep detour into colonial and post-colonial archives, also interviews with energy technocrats, geologists, petroleum engineers, corporate and government officials, but also long-term research with civil society groups, trade unions, and sort of assemblages of citizens who are mobilized against state-funded infrastructure mega projects. So that includes aluminum smelter projects, and centrally during my field work, a protest against a highway development in South Trinidad that was threatening to displace hundreds of families along sort of this stretch between Bebe and Mondesi in South Trinidad. So that's what you see pictured here, both on the left. These are sort of a number of individuals who are affiliated with the highway reroute movement. And I'm thinking about, again, how this gestures to a much longer tradition of the masquerade that unsettles the sort of equation or assembly of state power that I'm tracking as the state masquerade. So I'm going to also read a vignette that situates this in the long history of the sort of post-emancipation West Indies. So the origins of the carnival masquerade in Trinidad are fired in the crucible of emancipation in the British West Indies. On August 1st, 1834, the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 took effect in the British colonies, beginning a 6-year period of apprenticeship to prepare enslaved peoples for the nominal freedom of wage work. The fires of protest across the region led to the extension of full emancipation 2 years ahead of schedule on August 1st, 1838. Full emancipation did not alleviate the depraved conditions of colonial rule and plantation labor, but it did set the stage for a new masquerade. The emancipated masses, parodying and refashioning the pre-Lenten carnival of French Creole settlers in Trinidad, created a tradition entirely their own in what Trinbagonian theater historian Errol Hill describes as a complete metamorphosis. Drawing not simply on European carnival aesthetics, but also African traditions of costumery and performance, this masquerade emerged into view in the intermezzo between the passage of the Abolition Act and its formal adoption the following year. In February 1833, a band of African Creole revelers joined the carnival masquerade, adorned in military dress befitting of a colonial detachment. As Hill details, this began a tradition of military and naval masquerades that sought with brazen effrontery to debunk the authority that had been paraded before them so often in the display of military force. The organ of the planter elites in Trinidad, the Port of Spain Gazette, rubbished the ingenuity of the masqueraders' road work. The editors did not withhold their disgust toward the debutantes in the annual Carnival Festival. As they wrote, the mockery of the best militia band that has ever been embodied in the West was in very bad taste, and if intended to ridicule, must have missed its aim. The true genius of the military mas was lost on the editors of the Gazette. This mock detachment of sorry figures rather than a failed effort to emulate the pomp and circumstance of the colonial militia, contained within it a theory of political authority. Their mas unmasked the colonial state and its military wing as the sorry figures that the revelers parodied. It is the state itself and its performance and pageantry that adopts the form of the masquerade. We can think about police, other sorts of military deputies that actually are performing a kind of mas in order to make us believe in the state as such. The sole difference between the state masquerade and the people's masquerade is that the latter does not shroud its performance under the violent guise of legitimacy. It's in the clash between these masquerades that the possibility of direct democratic futures and their limits are drawn. So this is what I was sort of enraptured by. And I was looking at both two sides of my fieldwork, the energy technocrats, the government officials, the scientists and experts, and then again, the civil society groups, the other kinds of masquerades that are being staged as regimes of popular protest. But this forced me also to go back into the archives and the colonial history. Apologies for the distortion on the screen. But I wanted to understand the origins of this masquerade of permanence. Where did it come from? Why in the small peripheral Petro-State were these technocrats so certain that the half-life of Trinidad oil and gas was unlimited? Trinidad is one of the oldest, as I mentioned, petroleum exporting territories. In the 1930s, it became a destination, particularly from migrants from other parts of the Caribbean, particularly Eastern Caribbean, so Grenada, Barbados, St. Vincent, who were seeking work in the oil sector. And particularly they were seeking a regime of work outside of the plantation, right? These are, descendants of emancipated Africans who now face the decline of West India sugar and are looking to make a dignified life. And if you talk to Trinis today, most of them have a grandparent or great-grandparent that hails from one of these smaller islands. But the 1930s were also this moment of constant workers' agitation that culminated in the general strike of 1937. But as I was looking into this masquerade of permanence, I was going through the newspaper archives of colonial newspapers like the Port of Spain Gazette. And I'm going to read to you, again, a section that sort of describes the first emergence, to my mind, of this masquerade of permanence. So just as the innovation of beet sugar ushered the decline of the Caribbean sugar industry in the 19th century, the discovery of frontier reserves threatened Trinidad oil in the 20th. Despite this, local stakeholders and technologists offered confident forecasts of future production. They fell firmly into two camps. The first, represented by Trinidadian barrister Lennox O'Reilly, characterized oil as a wasting asset that would disappear in the near term and whose revenue should be expressly directed to other industries. One projection in 1928 anticipated a sharp decrease in oil production in 10 to 15 years. The second view, endorsed overwhelmingly by geologists and the local press, treated the oil reserves of Trinidad as inexhaustible. Experts agreed that production had barely scratched the surface of the vast onshore deposits, and even argued that oil was a renewable asset, and this is from this article, sustained by, quote, a continual process of subterranean chemical action at some indeterminate point between Trinidad and the mainland of Venezuela. Expecting that industrial operations would one day cover the entire island, they imagined the entirety of Trinidad transformed into one large oil city. Fueled by subterranean transformation, the interminable expansion of oil presented an easy resolution to the labor troubles of the British West Indies. This latter view won the day. Sir John Cadman, who was an engineer and founder of the mines department in Trinidad, insisted that the majority of oil deposits remained untapped. He applauded the innovations of the hardscrabble years of the early 20th century industry that, with the introduction of drilling muds and blowout preventers, permitted local outfits to drill to unprecedented depths of the Trinidadian subsoil. So I want to shift then to think about, again, sort of what's happening on the other side of this masquerade. So you have technologists and experts and colonial officials on one side. On the other side, you have the workers themselves. And this, again, erupts in June 1937 with the general strike that is sparked by sort of labor slowdowns and strikes in the oil fields of South Trinidad. On the right, this is an image of the Butler movement that sort of followed Uriah Butler, who was one of the charismatic leaders of the strikes. This photo is actually from later. This is from the 1940s, but I wanted to sort of give you a sense of the working class activity and how it looked at the time. So again, while technologists were projecting an unlimited future for Trinidad oil, Caribbean workers were trying to secure their own futures beyond the plantation economy through strikes, through sabotage, through political insurgency. So I'm going to read, again, sort of a vignette from where I'm describing this moment in June 1937. On Monday morning, nearly 1,000 workers assigned to the Dubs cracking units at Pointe-à-Pierre reported to the refinery for the start of the daytime shift. Large in number, the refinery workers controlled an essential choke point in the supply chain of oil to the British Empire. While a strike at a single oil field could be compensated for by drilling elsewhere, the shutdown of crude storage and refining operations could bring the entire industry to an effective standstill. Minutes after the open of the 7 a.m. working day, each unit assembled into small meetings. Out of the shop floor conferences, a larger contingent assembled and marched through the facility, ordering a stoppage of work. Seamlessly, the crowd grew to 900, fighting off resident overseers as they marched off the refinery estate. In impromptu meetings, the general manager of Trinidad leaseholders, the oil field management, yielded an offer of an additional 2 cents per hour on their wages. The workers refused and marched south to San Fernando. The unemployed joined them and looted goods from shops along the route. In the form of a carnival procession, strikers ordered the closing of businesses while, and this is a direct quote that you see on the screen, masquerading in the streets, singing, "We ain't working nowhere." Along the route, they compelled the managers of the St. Madeleine sugar factory to cease operation. In San Fernando, they promptly shut down the power station and the telephone exchange. Confronted by a volunteer police force from Port of Spain, they levied stones at the officers who returned a volley of bullets. One striker instantly dropped dead, and several others fell to the ground shot. The crowd dispersed, but the strike continued. And I'll just add that, this is a crucial moment in the political history, not only of Trinidad and Tobago, but the Caribbean in general. So C.L.R. James would return to this moment often in his writings, and he described it as a fire that runs up a forest that started in Trinidad and then went up the island through Barbados through the Eastern Caribbean to Jamaica. So this period of the 1930s is a period, again, of strike activity, of workers' agitation that serves as a kind of prelude to self-government. So Uriah Butler and the strikers were demanding self-government within the British Empire as opposed to crown colony government imposed from outside. We do, though, then see this as also a prelude to political independence in 1962. And the centrality of oil to the national economy persists in this period. But the sort of confrontation between these two forces doesn't stop simply because there's a nominal transfer of power from the British Empire to post-colonial elites, sort of embodied in the figure of Eric Williams as the first Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago. So I'm glossing a lot here, but in the post-colonial period, Eric Williams is confronted by a number of sort of clamors for direct democratic futures from below, from particularly the sort of Black Power revolution of 1970, which is launched against his government by students, the unemployed, and the urban poor. And they were really rebelling against what was called the doctor politics of Williams, that he was, again, a PhD, an historian, and that he sort of rules with an understanding that his model of expertise would guide the nation forward. So then in this period, in the early 1970s, Williams is being confronted by radical labor contingents. He's also being confronted by armed guerrillas, the National Union of Freedom Fighters, or NUF, that are gathering in the hills of North Trinidad. At the same time, oil multinationals are leaving Trinidad for other opportunities, particularly in frontiers like Alaska, which is opening up. at this moment. And under all this pressure, Williams in 1973 is preparing to retire from political life. He actually announces his impending retirement, where he derides these guerrillas for their sort of quixotic imaginary of freedom, because he says, you know, we already have Black power because he himself is a Black statesman. Suddenly, though, in October of 1973, some of you may remember this as a moment of the energy crisis, OPEC deploys the so-called oil weapon in response to the Israeli incursion in Palestine, in Golan Heights. This leads to a dramatic increase, of course, in oil prices and markets, and sparks an oil boom in Trinidad. So revenues skyrocket, multinational companies resume their interest in Trinidad's hydrocarbon assets. And now, awash with money, Williams sort of reverses his plan to retire. And in fact, during the oil boom, he makes a speech where he says, money is no problem, right? So with all of this excess revenue, Williams begins to embark on a state-led industrialization program, particularly into iron, steel, and petrochemicals, that's based on the use of natural gas that is sort of abundant in Trinidad's offshore reserves as a feedstock. Particularly the iron and steel complex, which is also known as ISCOT, was sort of the flagship project of Williams' effort to take on this masquerade of permanence. So in a speech, he says, you know, Nasser, the premier of Egypt, told me to go for steel, right? That to build a steel complex. And Williams also believed that steel was sort of an enduring market because he was a scholar of the Industrial Revolution. So he believed that steel was something that would expand in perpetuity. So now I'm going to read a section on this question. As the first independent state venture at the Point Lisas industrial estate, ISCOT, the iron and steel facility, opened in 1980 to great fanfare. Accruing costs of more than $1 billion Trinidad and Tobago dollars, popular assessment of the state-led industrialization strategy hinged on the feasibility of steel production and the presence of markets for intermediate and finished products. The design of the plant sought to unlock the full benefits of Trinidad's abundant natural gas resources. The choice of direct reduction technology allowed the government to make use of natural gas as a reducing agent and limit operational costs. In this metallurgical process, hydrogen, or H2, and carbon monoxide, CO, derived from natural gas are used to remove oxygen from liquid iron oxide. The resulting direct reduced iron, also known as sponge iron, is used as a feedstock for steel production. Due to an abundance of natural gas as a source of cheap energy, the iron and steel complex produced sponge iron and finished steel at competitive rates. Yet they encountered unanticipated technical difficulties. Excess sponge iron produced for export rather than for use in domestic steel production was commissioned following a deal with the Brazilian supplier of iron ore that agreed to purchase this iron for their steel mills. The Brazilian foreign exchange crisis, though, sparked by declining commodity markets in the early 80s, quashed this agreement and left Trinidad with surplus iron and no prospective buyers. Export options were further constrained by a geochemical oddity. This left the iron from the Trinidad plant especially vulnerable to reoxidation, which reverses the industrial process of purification when exposed to air and moisture during maritime transport. So rust was spreading through the iron that they intended to export. Here I should say that despite their appearance, metals are not the inert objects they're often imagined to be. You know, they're, as Andrew Barry, a political geographer, states, they are elements of lively, dynamic assemblages that may act in unanticipated ways, serving as a catalyst for political events. So although metals are dynamic substances, just like their liquid counterparts, we often describe metallurgical refining as a unidirectional series of chemical reactions in which purified metals are derived from iron ores. The direct reduction process in iron refining, for instance, involves the extraction of carbon monoxide and hydrogen from natural gas through a chemical interaction with steam or carbon dioxide. The steam reforming and carbon dioxide reforming techniques are expressed in the first two equations that you see at the top of the screen. These are two processes by which they extract carbon monoxide and hydrogen from natural gas. The carbon monoxide and hydrogen byproducts are then used to reduce iron oxide into purified metallic iron. So that's the equation you see at the bottom. So you see the Fe, the purified iron, is being extracted through this chemical process. The inscription of these processes presumes, though, a closed system of chemical interactions. When removed from the pristine confines of the laboratory, metals are exposed to conditions that can cause corrosion or rust. The result is a volatile substance that can be eroded by external forces and contingencies. So it's noteworthy that Williams staked his masquerade of permanence to steel. In contrast to the liquid character of crude hydrocarbons, the solid properties of steel deceptively appeared to safeguard against the predatory multinational interests that he sought to circumvent. While iron and steel comprise dynamic states of matter, we tend to talk about heavy metals as inexorably solid. An equally misleading impression of political order also governs the way we talk about the post-colonial state. The iron and steel complex, as the embodiment of this transition to post-colonial modernity, rested on the mistaken assumption that steel and state sovereignty are permanent states of matter. So as we transition out of the 1980s, Williams passes away in 1981. And as I mentioned, depressed commodity markets for steel, for oil, for natural gas, plunged Trinidad and Tobago into a recession. So famously, George Chambers, who was Williams' successor, says the party is over and it's time to get back to work. What then Trinidad does in the 90s and early 2000s is expand as a boutique supplier into other downstream products. So on the right, I have this sort of image of the Trinidad value chain. It's often called the Trinidad and Tobago model. The upstream refers to the actual extraction of oil and natural gas from the ground or from the sea floor. The midstream refers to the refining of crude oil or gas. And then the downstream, as you see, which is sort of the hallmark of Trinidad's industrial model, are these industries of heavy metals, of petrochemicals like ammonia fertilizers. And what joins this matrix in the 1990s is liquefied natural gas, or LNG. And that happens starting in 1992, when a small LNG supplier in Massachusetts approaches the Trinidad and Tobago government to build an LNG facility that they can then export via gas tankers to New England to meet sort of seasonal demand for heating oil in the winter. And this takes shape then by the end of the 90s, when Atlantic LNG, this consortium, comes together to expand natural gas production. And this is extremely successful and sort of creates a new boom period, a liquefied natural gas boom throughout the first decade of the 2000s. What this also does, though, is puts added pressure to extract more gas from Trinidad's offshore reserves in order to meet the demand to continue production at the facility. And the half-life, or the sort of sustainability of the Trinidad and Tobago model, came to rest on the exploitation of deep water oil reserves. And that's what we see on the left. This is a map of Trinidad and Tobago, the green sort of land masses, and then its maritime acreage. And as you see, sort of the ones that are filled in with darker red are pink. Those have been leased out to multinational companies. Those in sort of the lighter yellow were intended to be offered for bids, and the rest have not been leased out yet. And this has been sort of a difficult process where Trinidad has failed to unlock and open up the deep water frontier since 1998. So now I'm going to sort of read from this section of the manuscript. In energy industry parlance, deep water production generally refers to ventures at water depths of 1,000 feet or greater. Despite variations in drilling techniques, a broad consensus holds that deep water plays, or an industry shorthand for drilling campaigns, carry exceptional risks. Deep water ventures are regarded as low probability plays that require massive injections of capital. The cost of a single well often approaches $50 million US, and is 2 orders of magnitude greater than a typical onshore well. The costs of deepwater campaigns are exacerbated by the fact that the majority of deepwater wells are what they call dry holes. There's no commercial oil and gas to be found. Although no extractive play is assured of success, the deepwater requires investors to cut dramatic losses for several failed wells in their pursuit of an elusive gusher. Uncertainty pervades all extractive plays. The deepwater is no exception. Of the 8 deepwater wells drilled in Trinidad between 1999 and 2003, 3 were abandoned due to insufficient quantities of oil and gas below the total depth of the well. Others were riddled with mechanical troubles, and adverse ocean currents posed significant problems in 3 operations conducted by drill ships. The turn to the deep water portends a corresponding turn away from risk mitigation as a hallmark of post-colonial governance, characterized by high probability extractive plays, cost-efficient development, and timely state investment, toward a privileging of risk that feeds the practices of the state to these private multinational entities like BP, BHP, Shell, who are operating in the deep water. So while the deep water was yet to generate any return, its lucrative geology was still invoked as the spoils to be won through the winding back of certain sort of taxes and other economic provisions. No longer timely resources sowed judiciously prior to their exhaustion, fossil fuels appeared or were presented as limitless resources waiting to be unearthed with the aid of innovative extractive technologies. So I'm gonna skip ahead just to talk, I wanna talk a little bit about what I call road work and the research that I was conducting with civil society groups who were threatened with displacement. So the downstream effects of this failure to unlock the deep water reserves really did affect the working class most markedly, right? That people lost jobs as refineries and other facilities were shuttered. There's a withdrawal of social welfare programs and sort of food and gas subsidies. And the question that I sort of was confronted with was, how do ordinary people confront the distance between the narratives that the state is crafting about itself, this masquerade of permanence, and the realities of their abandonment and austerity? And this, again, it seems to parallel what we had already seen in the 1930s. And of course, this is me on the right of your screen back in 2014. So I'm going to read just a bit from my meditation on this group, the Highway Reroute Movement, that sort of was attached to a very charismatic figurehead, Wayne Kubal Singh, who I consider a friend, but also represented a truly grassroots sort of political foment that was also about calling attention to the misguided logic of state mega projects and development. So what I write here is, roads are quintessentially unfinished objects. Even upon completion, they require frequent repair to address seasonal wear and periodic breakdown. And the construction of roads precipitates more road through the construction of tributary routes. In turn, roads are vibrant archives of state planning. Unlike pipelines and electrical grids, which seem to function surreptitiously beneath the field of view, roads are eminently visible and endowed with aesthetic intent. So it's unsurprising that roads often emerge as an insurgent ground for practices of citizenship. Recent theoretical currents have been drawn unprecedented attention to infrastructures as vehicles of social reproduction. Here, an anthropology of infrastructure tries to deconstruct sort of the appearance of social worlds through inquiries into the obscured material and bureaucratic networks that lie beneath. But this is not exclusively the province of anthropologists or scholars at all. In clashes with the institutions and representatives that constitute the post-colonial state, the vernacular repertoire of road work uncovers these networks in order to take away its legitimacy, to compel us to recognize its arbitrariness, to reveal its contingent dimension. Even as we insist otherwise, there's a tendency to assume that the state is a thing, an object, that conforms to a prescribed set of instrumental functions. Of course, sometimes it does appear to do so, but how a given state works or does not remains an open question informed by its own historical particulars. So road work, which I observed and learned from this group of individuals, encompasses an array of practices that unsettle the presumed legitimacy of the state through blockades, occupation, strikes, and propaganda. While the Caribbean is often dismissed as a region of small states and dependencies that fail to conform to the normative expectations of sovereignty and governance, failed states perhaps is the one we often hear, roadwork demands that we draw lessons from such small places where the state appears less transcendent as an assembly of social actors and institutional structures. So just to add, in Trinidad, people will refer to the prime minister and parliamentarians by their first name. So they're Kamla, they're Dr. Rowley, they're Jack. They're regarded in very familiar terms. From the vantage of the Caribbean, suspension and incompleteness appear as operative conditions of the practice of sovereignty in general. Far from exceptional, the Caribbean is actually where the fact of the state as infrastructure is laid bare. So not unlike the fleeting temporality of Carnival, which we just experienced a week ago, roads are transient structures that are nonetheless considered to be timeless and objective features of the social landscape. All reification is indeed a forgetting, as Horkheimer and Adorno put it, by which the labor that is laid in the road and the masquerade that it serves are purged out of our memory. Roadwork, though, fights this reification by, to quote Marcuse, making the petrified world speak, sing, perhaps dance. And of course, in Trinidad, the road overflows with talk, song, and dance. Chioma, how am I doing on time? Because I can conclude here if you would like, or I can sort of do one more bite. So it's up to you.
I think that you can go ahead and proceed, Ryan. It's fine.
Okay, perfect. So I'm just going to conclude here that to sort of summarize the state of the manuscript, I want to read a little bit from the conclusion. This is a picture of me at CLR James' gravesite in Tunapuna, Trinidad, and you see sort of a selection from one of his many famous works, Beyond the Boundary, that's included on his headstone. So I wanted to say that really one of the things that structures this entire manuscript is the political philosophy of CLR James, and particularly the way that he's a relentless, as George Lamming called him, an evangelist for working class ingenuity and insurgent potential. And I look a lot to James's writings when he briefly was serving as the editor of the party newspaper under his former protege, Eric Williams, in the 1960s. And James is often here writing on Carnival. So he's known a lot for writing about sort of history and particularly cricket, right? Which again, he's noted for in Beyond the Boundary. But James is also writing about Carnival at this moment. And he's saying that, look at the preparations people make. Look at the self-organization they commit to every year to organize themselves into bands, to occupy the road, to stage these masquerades. And he's saying that this is actually a rehearsal or demonstration of the power that the Trinidadian working class or working people hold. So I end by trying to think about, how can we continue to confront what I've been calling the state masquerade with masquerades of our own. So I'm just gonna read a couple paragraphs, and I'd love to open it up for a conversation. But if I've demonstrated how the two sides of this hyphenated form, the Petro-State, came together, the survival of the Caribbean people demands that we drive them apart. To do so requires that we intervene in the Petro-State Masquerade to play a mass of our own, where the state shrouds the terms of its masquerade by retreating from the road into glass and steel edifices like skyscrapers, offices, and boardrooms. Sylvia Winters prophesies confrontation between those who justify and defend the system and those who challenge it will compel the state to reveal the inner workings of its own masquerade by returning the domain of politics to the road. CLR James' faith in the ordinary people of the Caribbean is stoked by his meticulous study of history. For James, the contours of the people's masquerade take shape in the formative decades of the plantation complex in the Americas. In the Making of the Caribbean People, a lecture delivered to the Second Montreal Conference on West Indian Affairs in 1966, James deploys Richard Ligon's 17th century travel narrative, the true and exact history of Barbados, against its triumphant christening of Barbados, and I quote, as a Leviathan, a well-governed commonwealth. James quotes at length from Ligon's recollections of an aborted plot by enslaved Africans in the 1600s to seize power by force. This, for James, and as he says, is the very beginning and the continuation of West Indian history. They wanted not only their freedom, but to remove their masters and make themselves masters of the island. For the colonial observer Ligon, this desire for freedom is incompatible with his Hobbesian endorsement of plantation order and discipline. In fact, he's very confused in this narrative about why are these enslaved Africans rebelling against the plantation order? Why are they fleeing to caves in northern Barbados? For him, it's actually unthinkable as, again, sort of a white British colonial subject. The masquerade of power inherited by contemporary statesmen like Williams and his successors from earlier planters, their overseer deputies and colonial militias of yesteryear, adorns itself in the image of this sea-dwelling Leviathan, what Hobbes sees as the sort of quintessential image of the modern state. At every instance, the Leviathan is confronted by another masquerade. The same imminent tradition that compelled enslaved Africans to make themselves masters of the island in 17th century Barbados recurs in Bois Caiman in 1791 in Haiti, Morant Bay in 1865 in Jamaica. In Trinidad, it presents itself in the Camboulay Rebellion of 1881, the Jose riots of 1884, the General Strike of 1937, and the Black Power Revolution of 1970. As James would return to in his address to the Oilfield Workers Trade Union Conference of Delegates in the last decade of his life in 1982, he says, "The mass movement creates power for anybody to take it. The power is right there lying about in the streets, and it has been lying about in the streets in Trinidad for some time." Lloyd Best, a Trinidadian economist, in his bad faith reading of James, cynically gags that you can't seize no power in the Caribbean. The Americans will put you out the next morning. Best is unable to grasp, though, what James means by power. Power lies in the streets, not in the Red House, the sort of building, the sort of parliamentary building in Trinidad. The seizure of power proceeds not from above, but from below. Turned against the logic of Leviathan, this masquerade is less concerned with the storming of the palace and the state house than with the dwelling in unity that anthropologist Connie Sutton, the mentor of my mentor, Deb Thomas, observed during the wildcat strikes of sugar workers in late colonial Barbados in the 1950s. Rather than the singular moment of the coup d'etat, this impulse grounds itself in the creative fount of the riot, the mob, and the Carnival Road March, not as a means, but as an end. In disputing the taken for granted location of power in the state and its edifices, this masquerade does not presume a moment when it retreats from the road to consolidate a new order of rulers who sit above society. The practice of mass politics must embrace the politics of mass. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Ryan, you have a question in the chat from Sydney Jackson.
Hello, Sydney. Let me get a chance to look at your question. Sydney, did you want to also read it out loud, or should I just read it off the chat? See if Sydney's still here. Well, I can read it out. So she's saying, "I'm interested in how you think about the performance, dependence masquerades as independence, component of masquerading on behalf of the state. Do you have any analogies to help you think about these performances calculated and intentional as opposed to free-form or responsive, as Mas can also sometimes be? How does the state perform as effectively as it does the imaginary of the waning Petro-State?" So what I would actually counter is that I don't think the masquerade or the carnivalesque is ever impromptu, right? I think it's actually, and this is what CLR James is attentive to, it's always meticulously organized, but not in a top-down fashion, right? That it occurs spontaneously, but there's a lot of planning. There's a lot of sort of dedicated preparation that goes into the carnival masquerade. And I think similarly, we see that again in the strikes, not only in 1937, but earlier in the 1930s of, Indian sugar workers who are sort of facing drought and blight, and also are coming together spontaneously to sort of march on the colonial state. So I'm a lot more interested, rather than thinking about or looking for a vanguard formation in the form of political parties or trade unions, although they have at sometimes facilitated this kind of masquerade or the people's masquerade, that this is actually, per James, something that we've seen throughout the history of the Caribbean. So I would say, yes, there's a dialectic of spontaneity and organization that is most clear in the carnival masquerade, but it actually, any sense that this just happens naturally or sort of as an impromptu formation obscures all of the work that happens on the ground to do this year after year. So that would be my answer to Sydney's question, but I believe she had to leave.
If anybody else has questions, feel free to come off mute or drop it in the chat.
And again, I'm happy to talk about any just sort of, empirical or sort of, questions about my methods, what the field work looked like, because these were disconnected bites, and I'd love to sort of fill in any gaps that might be remaining for any of you. Yes, Kevin?
Yeah, thank you so much. So I'm thinking about the concept of masquerade, and thinking along the lines of the idea that it might also have some kind of ideal of anonymity ingrained in it, and thinking about anonymity in terms of like relating to the state and trying to make it accountable for its actions, but also to force it to remove its own mask or its own masquerade act that is putting on. And I'm wondering how so on the one hand, you are proposing that we respond to a masquerade with a masquerade. So if we think about in terms of anonymity, then if the state is trying to hide, then we can also do some kind of actions that are also hiding, but also addressing the hidingness of the state. But I'm wondering how that might, in some ways, get in the way of looking the state in the face with our own faces, like, and also thinking individually, not just as collectively. And I wonder if you could speak to that in the context, but also in general, in terms of how you think about how states should interact with their own people as individuals, but also as collectivities.
Fantastic question. And I think that one of the ways, or one of the reasons that I continue to use this language of the masquerade is actually to sort of unsettle the logic of charismatic leadership, of sort of vertical political organization, right? That a lot of the political forces that I'm charting throughout this manuscript that emerge from below, as you're saying, are like faceless, they're leaderless. Sometimes the state will attempt to place a face on them, right? In 1934, when Indian sugar workers are marching on the Capitol, going north from the sugar estates in Chaguanas, they have this sort of leaderless movement that then when they reach the hills of Laventille in East Port of Spain, they're stopped by the colonial police and told, you have to appoint 7 representatives. Right? So there's actually an effort to break the ranks and to apply this logic of leadership that wasn't organic to the movement itself. Similarly, in 1937, there's a lot of focus on, I think, the legitimately charismatic, actually evangelical leadership of a figure like Uriah Butler, who sparked a lot of this movement really by holding these revival meetings and sort of Baptist revival meetings throughout the South. But it obscures again the sort of broad spontaneous working class insurgency that's happening during that period by forcing us to look at this in terms of a single leader or figurehead and their unique personality. So I play a lot also with the language that the colonial archive uses to talk about these people, talk about the striking workers as a mob, right? An unintelligible mob. And to say sort of, what if we actually sit with the mob instead of being compelled to appoint a specialized class of leaders, which is precisely what we see in the post-colonial period, right? There were certain demands for direct democratic governance, for the redistribution of land that were aborted by this new structure of the post-colonial state that took the form of the rule of experts, that took the form of the doctor politics of Eric Williams. So that's why I find the language of the masquerade so effective, right? It speaks to a very different orientation of politics that I think is actually crucial, right? I actually think that we shouldn't be, there shouldn't have to be a moment where we unmask our faces and show it to the state, right? I think we can turn away from, these sort of theaters of state power, like, the parliament buildings, like the state house, in order to govern communities on our own authority, right? So there are all these movements throughout the 70s in a Jamesian, CLR Jamesian political tradition for workplace assemblies, for village assemblies, for direct democratic governance, again, of communities and workplaces. So that's very different. You never have to actually turn and unmask yourself to the state. And I think that that's what I'm calling for, right? When I say at the end, there doesn't need to be a moment where you sort of retreat from the road, where you retreat from the protest in order to sort of stabilize yourself under a new class of ruler. We just had our first round of mayoral elections here in Chicago. We could think of the parallels, right? The meet the new boss, same as the old boss kind of mentality that we've grown accustomed to. So this is a very different articulation of politics, and that's what really I'm calling for. Yeah. Thank you for that question. It's brilliant.
Great. Thank you so much, Ryan. I think we're actually at time. So I think we'll just, if there aren't any more questions, I think we'll end it right here.
Tracy, did you want to jump in before?
Yeah, I had one quick question, Ryan. I just thank you for your talk. And I'm just wondering if you could say some about like the broader work you've been doing on campus to kind of put together a Caribbean studies kind of lab situation, and how might people find out more info or get involved in that?
Yes, I would love to talk about this. Please email me if you would like to get on our specific email list for sort of our Caribbean Studies cluster. Also stay tuned to the CSRPC announcements. We actually have a film series planned for the spring, which I'm very excited about. There are going to be 4 films, and we're doing this with the Film Studies Center. They've been amazing. They got us the original reels. This is going to be very professional. We were talking about like throwing a DVD and renting out a room, but this is going to be really legit. So there are 4 films. One from Haiti, Dominican Republic, that's a new release called Petro-State or Parsley. That's about the Parsley massacre of 1937 on the Haiti-Dominican borderlands. So it's a new dramatic film. Very excited about that. We also have a dramatic film from the 1970s in Suriname called Wampipel. A Trini film by one of my friends, Maya Cozier, called She Paradise. It's about a group of young women growing up in East Port of Spain that form this group of soca dancers. So it's a coming of age story. And then lastly, La Machette de Marteau, which is a Guadeloupean documentary film about sugar worker strikes in the 1970s. So stay tuned for all of those. We would love to see you there. And yeah, it's part of a wider initiative to try to build out sort of our offerings in Caribbean studies on campus. Thank you, Tracy.
Thanks.